second chapter of Matthew's Gospel begins with the account about the Magi, the wise men who journeyed to Palestine from the east to pay homage to Jesus during his infancy. After doing so, they returned to their country without informing King Herod that they had found Jesus in Bethlehem. Our reading today is about what happened afterwards. Basically, we learn that Joseph had three dreams. In the first dream, we read about it in Matthew 2:13, an angel appeared and directed him to flee with Jesus and Mary from Bethlehem to Egypt and, quote, remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him, close quote. At that news, Joseph realized that his family was not safe in Bethlehem. It was not safe in Judea. It was not safe anywhere else in Palestine. An infant named Jesus had become a national security threat to a ruler named Herod. The message and the image from Joseph's first dream, flee Judea and Palestine for Egypt, was that Jesus wasn't wanted or safe in Herod's Judea. And we learned that it became unsafe for all other children, not just Jesus. We tend to think it was unsafe for all other male children, but notice what the text says. Herod didn't just target the boys. Herod targeted all children below the age of 2. Imagine a homicidal ruler intent on murdering infants because they were young enough to fit the profile of an infant he didn't know where to find. So Herod went on the killing rampage. Since I can't find Jesus in Bethlehem and I don't know where Jesus may have gone, everybody's child and anybody's child under this age is considered a threat. And we don't see very many Christmas cards about that. We don't see many Christmas cards that depict the scene of Joseph, Mary, and Jesus rushing to Egypt, if we see any at all. Have you seen any? I have not. We don't have Christmas cards showing Herod's agents slaughtering infant children. We don't have Christmas cards showing wailing mothers who mourn the murder of their babies by the government. When was the last time you heard, let alone sang, a Christmas carol about the threatened Jesus as an infant, the marked for death Jesus, the refugee baby named Jesus? That imagery doesn't fit our notions of Christmas. We're comfortable with Jesus and Mary and Joseph being in Bethlehem. We're comfortable with the manger scene. You know, we're comfortable with visits from awe-inspired shepherds and later visits from adoring magi, but awestruck shepherds and adoring magi are not the only reactions we must reckon with concerning Christmas and Jesus. You understand, this is the first Sunday. Today is the first Sunday after Christmas. And some of us are beginning to take our Christmas decorations down, but are we comfortable with the horror, the post-Christmas horror we read about in Matthew's Gospel? We're beginning to take the nativity scenes down, but we still have notions of the baby Jesus, the little Jesus safe in Bethlehem, when on the first Sunday in after Christmas, in the Gospel of Matthew, we read about the Jesus who was not safe anywhere in Palestine. Matthew's Gospel reads us quickly past Bethlehem. So we read that Jesus wasn't long in the world before he was considered a personal, a social, and a political threat. Count that, a personal, a social, and a political threat to King Herod. And we should not skip over this detail. King Herod was the face of Zionist nationalism in Judea. Don't get that messed up. He was the face of nationalism. He was, for Herod, the infant Jesus wasn't a person to revere. He was an enemy to eliminate. That's a political message. Jesus wasn't 2 years old before he was the target of an assassination plot. And those of us who know about children who are considered threats because they are too poor, or threats because they are too from the wrong zip code, or threats because they are too looking this way or that way, or threats for some other reason, can identify with the Jesus who is the threat in the minds of the empire. Don't miss this. Jesus did not begin life, did not end life, and did not live as someone who was considered the friend of nationalism, be it religious or cultural or otherwise. Jesus was always a threat. And although the birth of Jesus was announced by angels to astounded shepherds as good news of great joy for all the people, Herod didn't consider himself blessed by Jesus. And we need to keep that in mind. There are some people who do not view the Jesus of the Gospels as a blessing, but view the Jesus of the Gospel as a threat. And some of them are religious people. Some of them call themselves Christians. Some of them do not want to have anything to do with this subversive Jesus. And let's get it straight. Jesus in this text is a subversive. He's not the friend of the state. He is a target of the state. Joseph and Mary didn't know it. Jesus didn't know it, but Herod viewed Jesus as a threat. And Joseph didn't know it until it was revealed to him in a dream. Why? Because God knew it. So an angel, a celestial messenger from God, warned Joseph in a dream to flee Judea and escape Herod to Egypt. Point there is, if we'll pay attention, God will reveal dangers, toils, and snares to us of folks who oppose what God is doing in our lives and in the world, even if we're unconscious. Sometimes the Lord shows us stuff, amen, that we wouldn't otherwise know. Joseph didn't have to have the front page of the Bethlehem Times to get the clue. The unpleasant but not romantic reality of Christmas is that Jesus and his closest kinfolk were forced to become refugees during his infancy because of Herod's sociopathic nationalism. Herod's view of Jesus was never based on respect, let alone reverence, for God or for God's will in the world. Herod viewed Jesus as a moral, a social, and a political threat, even when Jesus was an infant, even when Jesus was too young to do anything except walk around and coo, if that. Joseph's second dream happened when the family was in Egypt, when they were living in Egypt as refugees and strangers. Let's understand this. Refugees are always strangers. The scripture always uses that term, refugees and strangers, interchangeably. Make a note of that. Refugees are always strangers because they are not home. They are living in a strange place. They are living in a place where the language is strange, where the culture is strange, where the food is strange, where the music is strange. The refugees are always wondering, will I fit in here? This time an angel brought good news, that it was safe to return to Palestine and Judea after King Herod had died. Refugees always yearn to return home because they want to be someplace where they're not viewed and treated as strangers. Then and now, refugees are forced to take the worst jobs because you understand the home folks reserve the best jobs for themselves, and they leave the jobs they don't want to do for the refugees. And then they complain about the refugees taking the jobs. Sound familiar? Then and now, refugees were targeted for discrimination and abuse and violence. And the second dream meant Joseph and his family could return to Palestine. But Joseph's joy about being able to return to his homeland turned into anxiety when he learned that Herod's son, Archelaus, was king over Judea. Joseph wondered, does the apple roll too far from the tree? Sometimes feeling better doesn't mean feeling safe. Sometimes you can feel better but still not feel safe. We don't get Christmas cards that talk about the anxiety that Jesus and his family suffered as refugees. You don't see very many Christmas cards about Joseph and Jesus and Mary in Egypt. Imagine Jesus being the refugee child who was not like the other children because his mama and daddy weren't from Egypt. And you know how you treat the child when you are not from there. Those are the ones that are picked on. Those are the last ones that get picked on for games and teams. We don't have nativity scenes involving the refugees. We don't have much artwork, if any at all, that portrays refugees around the world as kinfolk to the infant refugee named Jesus. How many songs, how many carols have you heard about that refugee family? We hear about, sweet little Jesus, born and laid in a manger. We don't hear about the Jesus of Egypt. The Jesus, the dark-skinned Palestinian Jew living in Africa. Wonder why not? And then there was a third dream. In the third dream, Joseph is warned not to return to Judea, not to return to the southern part of Palestine. Instead, he settled his family in the northern district of Galilee in a town called Nazareth, a little out-of-the-way place that didn't have a good reputation. The infant who was threatened as a child wound up growing up in a, may I say it, backwater place called Nazareth. You recall what Philip said when he was told that Jesus came. Can any good thing? Nazareth was the wrong side of wherever the rich side was in Palestine. But that's where Joseph settled. And that's where Jesus grew up. We don't have very many Christmas carols. Wait. I'm trying to think. No, I don't remember any Christmas carols about Jesus in Nazareth. Jesus, the boy who comes back to Palestine, not as a refugee, but even in Nazareth, we don't read about him, sing about him. We don't have much artwork about him. We have to deal with the fact that our romantic notions of Christmas somehow don't get us past Bethlehem and a manger. We are stuck on a manger. I'm not knocking the manger scene, okay? Don't walk away and say the preacher is bad-mouthing the manger scene. I'm just asking, do we have a religion that gets us out of the manger scene, out of Bethlehem, and gets us into the realities that Jesus and his parents had to face? Or do we somehow have an aversion to having a religion that embraces the drama? And let's be honest, when you're a refugee under a death sentence, That's not a romantic sight. Let's be honest. When you're wondering whether you're going to fit in a strange country, that's not a romantic sight. And let's be honest, when you come back home and you realize that home isn't really home because you're really afraid to live where you thought you could live because you're not sure if living there is going to be safe, that's not a romantic sight. Joseph's dreams force us to recognize that Christmas is not just about the romantic scenes and images we like to sing and think about Jesus and Mary and Joseph. Christmas also involves some brutal realities. God's Son became a refugee due to nationalist hatred and fearfulness. God's Son became a refugee like the refugees who are fleeing war and violence and persecution in their homelands today. God's Son, like refugees around the world today, was marked as an outsider and treated like a threat, even when he was too young to know what being a refugee meant. God's Son was vulnerable because refugees are vulnerable people. Refugees can be targets of discrimination and bigotry based on prejudice and fear. Refugees are vulnerable people, and that raises a question: what are religious people doing to confront the Herod-like policies of our time that force people like Jesus to become refugees? Let me just put it another way. Do we know Jesus well enough? Do we know Jesus well enough, beyond our romanticized notions of Christians and Christianity, to recognize Jesus in the plight of refugees today? Do we know Jesus well enough to recognize the murderous hatred faced by refugees today? Do you recall that just this past week, a woman in this country stabbed a woman to death because she thought she was Mexican? Do you recall that in this country, that woman had earlier driven a 12-year-old boy and driven her car into him on the sidewalk because he was black? Do we recall this part of being Jesus? People who support policies that oppress refugees and asylum seekers appear to have forgotten that what Jesus said in Matthew 25, "For I was a stranger. For I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me." Think about that when you hear and read about putting up a wall on the U.S. southern border with Mexico to keep refugees out of the United States, people like Jesus. Think about the infant refugee named Jesus when you hear and read about refugee children being separated from their parents at the border and placed in holding pens, children like Jesus. Think about the refugee named Jesus and his working class parents when you hear and read about policies that capture and deport refugee working parents and separate them from their children because the parents are undocumented refugees. How can we love the refugee named Jesus and hate other refugees and call ourselves Christians? Well, preacher, you're meddling with folk. No, I'm not. The truth about Jesus always forces our religion to face our realities. The truth about Jesus always forces us to get beyond our romance and deal with realities. We live in a world where the love of God demonstrated by Jesus is hated by sociopathic leaders such as Herod. In the same way that Herod had religious advisors, we live in a nation where religious people such as Franklin Graham and Jerry Falwell Jr. and Robert Jeffries and Richard Land and Jack Graham are cheerleaders and chaplains for corrupt and abusive political leaders such as Donald Trump and Jefferson Sessions. Don't forget that Jeff Sessions, as a senator, was recommending putting up a wall. And keeping immigrants out of the United States. Don't forget that now in this current season, there have been fewer people who have been granted asylum this year than in any previous year. So much so now that the number of people who've granted asylum is so low, there may as well have been a wall. So during this Christmas season, let's refuse to romanticize Jesus. Let's see Jesus in the refugee infants and toddlers and children. Let's see a worried Joseph and Mary in refugee and asylum-seeking parents. Let's see Herod. Let's see Herod in the cultural and religious nationalists and rulers who claim to follow Jesus while supporting and imposing hateful policies and practices against people who are refugees like Jesus. Let's see and honor the refugee child named Jesus by seeing Jesus in the refugee children and the parents of our time. Let us know and honor and follow Jesus, the refugee who came to us from God and who was marked for death as a threat by a ruler named Herod. And then let's give thanks and know and honor and follow Jesus as the refugee from God who is our liberator, not our threat. Jesus, the refugee who liberates us, not who threatens us. Jesus, the refugee who loves us, but does not try to abuse us. And let us, through it all, see God working. See God working to be neighbors with us and to make us neighbors with God. How? By the way we treat refugees like Jesus. For I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. Lord, when did we see you as a stranger and not welcome you? Whenever you saw one of them, you saw me. Amen.